Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Southern Prosperity and Economic Pain During the Cold War Years. As we'll discuss in a moment, the Cold War years covered 1946 to 1991 specifically. During these years, the Southern economy lost its regional distinctiveness and became fully part of the American economy at long last. At the same time, the American economy became part of the global economy, taking the Southern economy with it. This lecture will examine those changes. We'll cover these topics: the U.S. economy and how it prospered from 1945 until about 1973, Southern prosperity in those years, one of the most significant changes in the South, the mechanization of agriculture, and the economic struggles of the 1970s and 1980s. Keep in mind that while we today think that the economic prosperity of the U.S. and the South after World War II is the common lot of America, such long-term prosperity is really an aberration. It is not the norm. Prosperity was, however, the necessary economic precondition for the great political and social changes, particularly the Civil Rights Movement, that came in the 1950s and 60s. The failure of those movements to secure and retain their gains, that is, the reason we have lost many of those gains, is in part from the loss of prosperity of that era, approximately 1945 to 1973. At least in the South, prosperity came because the U.S. did not demilitarize for more than a few years after World War II. With the Korean War, the U.S. reactivated its military and continued to maintain it because of the Cold War. Let me say a word about the Cold War, 1946 to 1991. This was the era in which former allies against Nazism, the United States and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, competed for world domination after World War II. With the development of more and more powerful nuclear weapons and the change of delivery systems from bombers to missiles, as well as the development of the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the ongoing struggle between superpowers was much lower key than full-blown war. The antagonists, the US and USSR, won allies across the globe, engaged in propaganda campaigns, subverted one another, economically strong-armed friends and enemies, and engaged in proxy wars. The collective security agreements among nations, from NATO and the Warsaw Pact to the United Nations, generally kept proxy wars relatively small. But both sides pushed too hard, which led to serious problems with their competing empires. The Vietnam War bogged down the Americans and reduced their standing in the world. The Afghan invasion did the same thing to the Soviets. Eventually, stresses in the Soviet Union and a long-term economic downturn there led to its dissolution. It broke up into constituent parts in 1991. What the Cold War did for the United States was to militarize its economy and funnel trillions of dollars into defense plants distributed with a mind toward their impact on congressional power. This was what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex in his presidential farewell address on January 17, 1961. The military-industrial complex is one reason for the South's economic prosperity beginning in the 1950s. Prosperity in the South grew as part of overall U.S. prosperity between World War II and the mid-1970s. We could spend an entire course on U.S. society in this prosperous era, but for now let's look at how the economy grew under four U.S. presidents: Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson. In the aftermath of World War II, President Truman faced economic troubles and uncertainty. He himself was unknown, untested, and untrusted by policymakers and the U.S. public, and he succeeded to the office after the death of a wildly popular president, FDR. Americans feared that the Depression would return after the war, and with approximately 12 million veterans to be released from military service, the labor market might indeed have tanked. Truman faced price inflation and labor unions that had not struck for higher wages for the duration, only to see company profits soar, were restless. Suffice it to say that Truman got a grip on these things at least well enough that he was elected president in 1948. Truman proposed a number of government programs to prevent another depression. You see a short list of his areas of concern here. He advocated for better employment insurance with a federal financial component, and he maintained FDR's Fair Employment Practices Committee, though only through executive orders, so it was underfunded and weak. Truman also upgraded federal programs for housing projects, promoted federal housing support programs, and promoted regional development programs similar to the TVA. One of the signature programs of the Truman administration that specifically contributed to solving immediate problems as well as long-term prosperity was the GI Bill. Passed under FDR in 1944, but paying its benefits to 1952, then reactivated in smaller versions, the GI Bill provided federally funded grants to returning veterans that paid college tuition and a living stipend, made very low interest loans available for veterans to build small businesses, and restructured the federal home loan program for veterans. The GI Bill had two significant effects. It made it possible for veterans to integrate slowly back into the civilian workforce. College students, for example, stayed out for at least 2 years. Small entrepreneurs created their own jobs with federal financial backing. The GI Bill also had a multiplier effect. Trade schools, community colleges, and universities sprang up or expanded dramatically all across the United States. Students learned skills that meant the nation had made a long-term investment in their productivity and creativity. And small businesses not only bought goods, but many also grew to provide good jobs. After the 4 terms of FDR and the fairly dramatic upswing in government activity compared to prior administrations, presidents began having much more significant impact on the U.S. economy by turning economic policy into political proposals. There was still great tension between those who wanted little intervention and those who wanted more, and those groups operated as wings of both the Republican and Democratic parties. There was tremendous pressure from the anti-government program wing of the GOP on President Eisenhower. And though he was in that camp, he recognized that the government could not withdraw from economic intervention. The best it could do was channel intervention in particular directions. Republicans tended to channel funds toward businesses, while Democrats channeled money toward consumers. Eisenhower did sign a tax cut bill that triggered a recession through much of his second term because it wasn't targeted. More on that in a minute. But he intervened in the economy mostly by infrastructure and investment projects that, he hoped, would have a multiplier effect of their own. Ike encouraged the federal government to invest with Canada in improving the St. Lawrence River so ocean-going vessels could ply their way to the Great Lakes, benefiting both nations. Probably the most famous project Ike oversaw was the creation, though not completion, of the interstate superhighway system. Federal funds had gone to states to build their own stretches of national highways since 1916, but beginning with the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, the feds oversaw civilian-military dual-use highways based on the German autobahns Ike saw in World War II. A similar dual-use program was atomic energy for civilian use. Now, a cynic can argue that this was merely an attempt to make nuclear arms stockpiles palatable to civilians by promising them free energy. Nevertheless, the entire nuclear power plant industry is the result of this program. Americans freaking out about the first launch of a satellite into outer space, the Soviet Sputnik success of October 1957, led to Ike's support for the development of an American space program overseen by NASA, elevated from a small program in 1958, and federal largesse directed at expanding graduate education in sciences and technology, the National Defense Education Act of 1958. This act provided grants to graduate students in particular fields and is the foundation for federal funding of students today. It was proposed by Alabama Congressman Carl Elliott, a Democrat. The effects of all of these programs have been profound and, for economic growth, extraordinary. Do they come with a price? Of course they do. And dealing with those hidden costs is a drag on our economy as well as our environment today. But back then, those costs were out of sight and out of mind. What led Americans to discount any such costs was not mere blindness to long-term effects, though blindness certainly played a role, but because the economy boomed more and for longer than it had before. American gross national product doubled from 1950 to 1960, then doubled again to 1970, from $0.28 trillion in 1950 to $1.02 trillion in 1970. This was driven, like so many other boom periods in an industrial economy, by cheap energy. In this case, cheap oil. The price per barrel of West Texas Intermediate, a standard for tracking the market, was $1.20 in January 1947, rising slowly to $4.30 in December of 1972. By January of 1973, 1 month later, oil jumped to $10.10 a barrel, and by the end of the 1970s, it was $32.50 a barrel. So, for the duration of our discussion, cheap, plentiful oil powered American prosperity. So did the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us of, but that he also helped build. In the 1950s, the majority of federal money sent to the states was for support for military installations and defense industry spending. In the 1950s and 60s, much of this spending was on advanced high-tech weapons systems, particularly missiles and weapons platforms like aircraft, ships, and submarines. Another driver of the economy in those years was consumer spending. Because there was so much money in the system, the American dream began being expressed as achievement of a middle-class lifestyle defined in large part by the ability to consume goods and services. We see this in the rates of various kinds of ownership. Auto ownership rose to 75% of the population by 1960, with television ownership even higher at 87%. Home ownership, too, rose to 60% of the population and qualitatively changed as well. Federal highway funding merged with Americans' desire to own property and with land development companies to fuel suburbia. Prosperity continued into the 1960s under Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Following Harry Truman's late-term proposals, as well as Ike's business orientation and the material needs of the Cold War, Kennedy proposed a weak war on poverty, an expansion of health insurance for the elderly, and federal aid to education, with much of the funding going to improve the lives of individuals. He also bundled stronger, more successful proposals under the label The New Frontier. He proposed a targeted tax cut that, once imposed, stimulated the economy to bring it out of the recession that Ike's tax cuts had fostered. With renewed prosperity, he proposed some systematic changes in federal spending, such as making money available for cities to update their urban cores, usually at the expense of the poor, often the black poor, whose homes were destroyed to make way for badly conceived highways and warehouse districts. He also created foreign policy initiatives called the Peace Corps and the manned spaceflight program, through which he challenged us to land on the moon. After Kennedy's assassination in Dallas on November 22, 1963, Lyndon Johnson, a Texan, rose to the presidency. Johnson had been head of the Texas National Youth Administration during the New Deal, as well as having been a classroom teacher. He went to Congress in 1937 and was a senator from 1948 until 1961, when he became vice president. He won election in 1964, but did not stand in 1968. Using the powerful shock and sentimental attraction of Americans to the assassinated Kennedy, Johnson was able to pass his own version of the New Deal, which he called the Great Society. Whereas the New Deal was born of an economy of scarcity, LBJ's Great Society programs were born of prosperity. He proposed multiple pieces of legislation to Congress, then worked to get them passed, often successfully. His first order of business was to pass the proposed Civil Rights Act that had stalled in Congress in 1963. This passed in 1964. LBJ also succeeded with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Great Society included federal aid to education and health, environmental laws, consumer safety laws, buckle up, and importantly, a robust war on poverty that created or expanded the welfare state as we know it. The war on poverty programs were easy targets for later politicians to underfund so that they did not achieve their goals of helping what social critic Michael Harrington had called the other America. But those programs could not be killed either. They continue today. So much of the good LBJ wanted to do was buried under his prosecution of the Vietnam War. This war made LBJ's legacy not the one that he wanted, but made it tragic. The Southern economy trailed that of the rest of the nation. So in the immediate aftermath of World War II, it slumped, then it picked up by the mid-1950s. Prosperity was a significant change for the South. Prior to the Civil War, the plantation South was by far the most prosperous region of the United States, though that wealth was badly distributed even among whites and rested on the labor of the enslaved, who were cut out of the benefits of prosperity completely. The New South from Reconstruction until World War II was never prosperous generally, though a few large property and industry owners did make fortunes. The common lot of all but the rich throughout the history of the 19th and early 20th century South ran from abject poverty for many, poor incomes for most, and comfortable incomes for a few. The emerging prosperity of the Cold War era, especially since it was so much more equally distributed, was a significant change. To understand how the South changed, I follow economic historian Gavin Wright's interpretations. First and foremost, he maintains that the post-World War II Southern economy was not an extension of its old economy, but was something new. By 1940, the Southern economy was well on its way to being integrated fully into the national economy, so that it lost its regional identity, even if some pockets retained distinctive Southern characteristics. Federal policies, particularly AAA payments directly to farm workers rather than landlords, and federal minimum wage legislation that closed the extreme wage differential between the South and the rest of the nation, began integrating the South's low-wage economy into a higher-wage national labor market. Extremely low wages had been the only real tool Southern economic boosters had to lure outside capital. The resulting widespread poverty and excessive power differentials attracted some investment, but did not attract well-to-do immigrants. Consequently, the South was unable to expand its industrial and financial base very much, and what industries it attracted had little multiplier effect. When the South no longer had its usual tool, it had to find other ways to attract industry as the driver of prosperity. Although African Americans and many working class whites left the South for northern jobs, and many who were educated in southern colleges left the region, a brain drain. Many others stayed, and as Wright notes, they were, quote, actively engaged in selling themselves to the outside world, unquote. Southerners did this by providing benefits to recruited industries, investment in education, and lobbying for their fair share, usually meaning more than others, of military spending. Without significantly lower wages to entice industry, states and municipalities offered other goodies like bond finance infrastructural improvements for specific businesses, long-term tax exemption for locating in the South, and significant reductions in overall corporate rates. This reverses the trends of the pre-World War II South that had notoriously high corporate taxation. In addition, states invested in college research that would be beneficial to industries they wanted to attract. This movement followed the success of the North Carolina Research Triangle that made that state a leader in Southern and national research investment and products. It drew outside investments as national industries found that kind of research useful. This idea pertains still. In late 2018, Alabama historian Wayne Flint noted that 5 research areas exist throughout Alabama. All but one began with public universities, and they were the hubs of prosperity, leaving the rest of the state behind. Military and defense industry spending also bolstered Southern prosperity. The Cold War made military readiness and defense industries important, and Congress made sure they were funded, even though there has been fluctuation over the years. Southern boosters and lawmakers exerted great pressure on Congress and the Pentagon to make sure their areas were well provisioned. Much of the high-tech defense industry ended up in the 11 states of the former Confederacy, which also has 40% of the total number of military installations maintained by the federal government. An integral part of the process of increasing prosperity, that is, both a cause and an effect, is a change in Southerners' attitudes about so-called outsiders and outside money. Southern states and cities abandoned their traditional disdain and suspicion of outsiders, even if individuals did not, once they saw the links between outsiders and prosperity. And here we can't discount the thing that made it possible for Southerners to relax at home and for people not native to the region to make a life in the South: air conditioning. Apalachicola, Florida physician John Gorey patented a compressed air cooling system in 1851, but it was only in 1902 that Willie Carrier of Buffalo, New York, made a business of cooling industrial buildings. Other companies experimented with making home-sized and expensive units, and in 1947, they were small and cheap enough that 43,000 homes had window units. The market expanded so that almost every new home built in the late 1960s came with air conditioning, and according to the Department of Energy, 100 million American homes, 86%, are so equipped today. Southern boosters had long existed, but it was something of a grim joke that what they boosted didn't exist. Elites in towns told tall tales about the wonders of their homes in order to entice investors or visitors. Poor communications and travel meant that potential investors might show up without sufficient research, and once in the vicinity, might find it easier to make the investment than waste the trip. This is the same strategy as resort salespeople who offer you a free stay as long as you sit through the sales pitch use. From the 1950s to the present, given their willingness to support investment with bonds and tax breaks, the South has adopted a business-friendly attitude. Gone for the most part is the suspicion of the outsider and the fear of concentrations of capital. Now Southerners want those things and are willing to make real deals to get them. Because of rising prosperity and the successes of the Civil Rights Movement, net outmigration ended in the mid-1960s, so that now there is a net gain of population in the South. Much of this is highly concentrated in bustling economic hubs and in areas that appeal to retirees. One of the reasons and results of prosperity is that the long-standing problems of legal and even social inequality between races has eased. In many places, boosters and members of the Chamber of Commerce understood that both Jim Crow segregation and the upheavals of the struggle for equality made the South an unappealing place for outside investment, and they papered over quarrels and often supported resolutions that went against their own white supremacist desires. Such is the case of Birmingham in 1963, when even though Bull Connor was well supported by white supremacists, the business community and others succeeded in changing the city's form of government right out from under him, thus disempowering him and reaching an agreement with protesters about desegregation. The federal courts made this an easy choice. Atlanta, too, sold itself as the city too busy to hate under mayors William Hartsfield and Ivan Allen. They were about business more than race, which is a significant change in Southern racial politics. According to historians William Link and Gavin Wright, probably the most significant change in the South, one that underlay the region's incorporation into the national labor market, was the destruction of the old plantation system of labor that had defined the new South of destitute sharecroppers. This destruction came from the mechanization of cotton farming. It's difficult to say if the mechanization of planting and harvesting came first, or if labor fleeing the farm did. These things reinforced one another. Mechanization of southern farms came first to those areas that were most like the Midwest, geographically flat, large farms where corn and grains prevailed over cotton and tobacco. Mechanized planting, cultivating, and harvesting corn and grains were relatively straightforward, while cotton and tobacco required ongoing tending during the season and deft motions of the pickers at harvest. Mechanization required both a power source and task-specific tools, so farmers had to have serious need and the ability to invest in mechanical tools rather than cheap labor. Wright believes that farm laborers and sharecroppers left southern farms first in the Great Migration, then for wartime service or employment, which was the catalyst for big farmers to invest in capital-intensive machinery to replace labor. That happened in stages. Tractors provided the power source for this change from human and animal labor to machine labor. The South, particularly the Cotton South, was mule country. In fact, 2/3 of the mules in the United States worked in southern fields as late as 1948, and the agricultural census in 1955 showed 1.4 million southern farms still used mules exclusively. Many factors impinged on adoption of tractors, the most important being the size of farms. The average southern farm worker tilled 25 acres of row crops and had 11 acres of pasture. This was too small for tractors, but was fine for a pair of mules. Nevertheless, as historian George Ellenberg explains in his book, Mules South to Tractor South, tractor manufacturers worked on models to fit small farms, while county extension agents pressed the gospel of efficiency as the measure of farming success. It was economically feasible to have early large single-purpose tractors and implements on the large farms in Texas and in the delta lands of Mississippi. But small farm economics demanded tractors that could do all the tasks of mules, that is, supply motive power for every task on the farm and be small enough to work effectively in relatively tight spaces. International Harvester entered the general-purpose tractor market first with its 1924 Farmall. 1929 model is shown here. Pneumatic tires became available in 1932, which improved performance and ease of maintenance. Then in the 1930s, John Deere entered the market. The Deere Model B allowed multiple row cultivation, so the farmer could go from working 8 acres per day to working 20 or more. But even these were too large, so Alice Chalmers developed a 16 horsepower tractor that weighed in at only 2,100 pounds and sold for $495. Advertisers, farm magazine authors, and county extension agents fed developing markets for tractors by touting efficiency and ease, slowly changing farm attitudes and self-definition of worth from pride in how hard they worked to desire to enjoy less labor and more free time. George Ellenberg tells the story of mule proponent Wayne Dinsmore, who said in 1939 that the, quote, most important obstacle to draft animal use was that they required too much time and attention compared to tractors, unquote. And mules were slow, plodding along at 1 to 2 miles per hour when even a tiny tractor pulled at 5 miles per hour. Tractors replaced mules almost entirely by 1960. And, as Gavin Wright notes, in 1949, 6% of the U.S. cotton crop was harvested mechanically, and by 1972, 100% was. This means that not only did motive power replace mules, but that implements to conduct the various stages of plowing, planting, cultivating, and harvesting had been perfected. Finally, as mechanical cultivation and the lure of an easier life in city work replaced labor on the farm, farmland was consolidated into fields large enough to take advantage of the economies of scale that tractors and huge combines provided. The results of mechanization were that 350,000 sharecroppers and small farmers left their fields during the 1940s, rising to more than 1 million moving away in the 1950s. Sharecropped plantations converted into giant mechanized corporate farms that did not need many laborers. Sharecropping was seriously wounded by federal policies in the 1930s, then killed dead by the second wave of farm mechanization after 1954. By the 1960s, the Southern economy was highly integrated into the overall American economy. This is not to say that there weren't many pockets where the local landlord controlled the lives of farm workers, but that was waning and no longer so widespread that there was a discernible Southern regional economy. This meant that the South had benefited from the prosperity that affected the rest of the U.S. for 2 decades, but it also meant that the South suffered from the problems that affected the U.S. economy in the long downturn of the 1970s and 80s. Just as the Southern economy Americanized, the American economy globalized, with all the disruption attendant to another major shift in the playing field. The Cold War led the U.S. to spend lots of money, which in many ways kept the economy going pretty well, but got overheated when we escalated the war in Vietnam, then funded both the manned spaceflight program and the Great Society, all under Lyndon Johnson. Beginning in 1967 and escalating after 1968, government spending on guns and butter was just too much for the economy and led to inflation of the currency and stagnation of business activity. This might have lasted only a few years if the Organization of Oil-Producing Countries, OPEC, composed of mostly Arab states, had not cut production to punish the U.S. for its support of Israel in the build-up to the 1973 Arab-Israeli War. In 1 month, the price of oil tripled, and supplies were slim, leading not only to increased cost to consumers for everything from transportation to food. Almost all U.S. consumer good transportation had a significant trucking component, but also to supply interruptions. The nightly news, back in the days before 24-hour news channels and social media, showed the results you see in this slide. Huge, long lines at gas stations. I remember traveling with friends every other week from college back to home, paying the driver, but also having to provide a gallon of gas because it was so hard to get. Post-war American prosperity had been built on cheap and abundant oil, and when that suddenly stopped being the case, our national economy suffered. Add to this international monetary problems and President Nixon's wage price controls designed to halt inflation that ran 10% per year for some commodities, and the U.S. suffered a recession 1973 to 1975. Inflation and slow growth in business activity plagued the U.S. economy. To change these things, President Reagan increased deficit spending to fund businesses, called supply-side economics, and the Federal Reserve tightened the money supply to check inflation. After a serious but short depression in 1981 through 83, the economy grew until another recession in 1990 to 91. After 1992, the end of the Cold War and computer technology economy led the U.S. economy to a 16-year general upswing. The swings between recession and prosperity are still less obvious in the South than other areas of the country, but Southerners feel them. Essential government installations and high-tech research continue to receive funding even in the worst of times. But Southern farmers, like farmers around the country, are plagued with reduced crop support and the vagaries of the global markets that buy their crops but also compete with them. In summary, during the Cold War years of 1945 through 1991 and a bit beyond, the Southern economy slowly lost its regional distinctiveness and became part of the American economy, while the American economy became part of the global economy. To examine that transformation, we talk about overall U.S. economic prosperity to 1973, the distinctiveness of the Southern economy and how it joined the U.S. economy in prosperity, the importance and trajectory of agricultural mechanization, and the struggles faced by the U.S. economy in the 1970s and 1980s. We situated our discussion in the Cold War. For retaining a military presence in the U.S.'s ongoing struggle against the Soviet Union and, after 1950, Communist China for world domination, led the South to prosper from hosting 40% of U.S. military bases and many defense industry plants. But federal spending on infrastructure and the consumer economy of the 1950s played a large role in Southern economic growth as well. Southern business and political leaders seized opportunities to sell the South as a place for business. Rather than offer only low-wage workers, a benefit eradicated by federal wage laws in the 1930s, these post-war boosters offered municipally funded infrastructure improvements and state and local tax abatements to new businesses. Southerners' attitudes toward outside capital and outsiders in general eased as well. Air conditioning and a business-friendly climate, including at least the beginning of a resolution of long-standing racial inequality, countered outmigration with immigration by the mid-1960s. The last vestiges of Southern economic distinctiveness, the sharecropped plantation and cropland systems, fell to mechanization of agriculture. We can't say for sure if losing farm labor led to mechanization or if mechanization drove tenants from the fields. It's probably both. But the results are the same. By 1960, most farms had switched from mule power to tractor power, and by 1972, the entire commercial cotton crop was harvested by machines. This resulted in first farm workers, then farm owners leaving the farm. Corporate agribusiness, touting the gospel of efficiency of scale, enclosed those lands so they could be farmed by machines. Finally, inflation and slowed business activity at the national level during the late 1960s hurt the South too, and was aggravated by the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. The U.S. economy lumbered along until it picked up in the mid-1980s. Then the end of the Cold War and rise of computer technology sectors drove a recovery after 1992. During the Cold War era, the economy of the South was incorporated into the U.S. economy that itself played on a global stage. This then ends the lecture. And as always, thank you for your attention.